What does it mean to be triggered? This term is often casually used to refer to having an emotional reaction to something that is disturbing, such as violence in media or even in random social settings. But there is a clear distinction between being triggered and being uncomfortable. Welcome back, my lovely people. For those of you who are new here, my name is Kayla and I make videos about BPD and all things mental health. So if that sounds good to you, be sure to hit the subscribe button down below as well as the bell notification up top to not miss out on Mondays when I do release new videos. Okay, so triggers or feeling triggered are, according to me, something that is very important to understand when within the BPD community. So today we're really going to be breaking down what a trigger is, what are common triggers, and how to minimize triggering situations to ease our life. Now, it's firstly important to understand what a trigger is. Triggers essentially are stimuli that brings us back to past traumatic events and that elicit a negative or very harmful reaction within us. So it's not just, oh, I'm feeling triggered, which means that someone is bothering me or annoying me. No, feeling triggered is getting in contact with some type of stimuli, whatever that looks like for you, and being literally brought back to this past traumatic state or event. Though commonly used to refer to the experience of people with post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, the word trigger or feeling triggered can apply to different mental health disorders, so things like eating disorders, substance abuse, or anxiety, and of course, BPD. Now that we understand what triggers are, I want to talk about the different types of triggers and how they play out in day-to-day life. So the first one are internal triggers, and this is really anything that happens internally, so memories, physical sensations, or emotions. So for example, let's say that you're out for a run and your heart starts to pound. This might trigger a memory of in the past you were being chased down by an abusive partner threatening to kill you, and during this time you remember, or your body remembers, your heart racing and pounding. So now when you're on a Tuesday morning out for your jog in your safe neighborhood and your physical heart sensations starts to increase, then it might bring you back to this triggering event. So other types of internal triggers, we have things like muscle tension, anxiety, loneliness. So whatever that looks like for you. Now, the second type of triggers really has to do with everything that is external, so really environmentally focused. So whether that's a person, a place, a date, a certain smell. Common examples of external triggers would be things like arguing with a partner. I know for me personally, when someone raises their voice at me, that is one of my external triggers. Other things might be a specific date. So if you have trauma, for example, around Christmas time or the holidays, that might be something for you. Or a smell. So there's a smell linked to a traumatic event. If you were sexually assaulted and there's a specific scent around, then being reintroduced to that scent later in life might trigger you once again. Or sometimes it's even just a specific person that's associated to this past trauma. So just seeing the other person might elicit this triggered feeling within you. At this point in the video, you might be wondering how triggers form. How come two people can live a similar or the same experience, but only one person comes out traumatized? And the reality is that the research is not really clear as to how triggers are formed. The best guess that they have is that non-traumatic memories and traumatic memories are stored differently in the brain. And so when faced with past traumatic memories, the brain actually interprets them as current, which sends our body into this fight, flight, freeze response. We also know that triggers can cause a strong emotional reaction before the person even knows that they're upset. So often triggers have a strong sensory connection, so sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, as well as habitual patterns. So for example, an alcoholic who associates drinking with a specific activity, so maybe every time they go into their kitchen, they get triggered just by the setting and the habit of it without necessarily realizing what's going on. This leads me to my next point, which is how to cope with triggers. Now, we can avoid triggers as best as we can, but at some point, life is unpredictable and it can become really impractical to try to avoid them at all costs. So take, for example, if you're highly triggered by Christmas music, is it then the most practical and healthy thing to avoid shopping malls, grocery stores, coffee shops, and basically all social settings for 2 months? Probably not. In life, there will always be uncomfortable and scary and emotionally activating people and places and things. So here is a trigger toolbox for you. The first thing in this toolbox is to learn how to name our triggers. In the fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin, when you know his name, you then become free of his threats. And it's the same thing with triggers. The more that we can identify and name them, even keeping a physical list of people or sights or sounds or things that trigger us, we become more empowered by our ability to either control our environment or to learn how to do slow progressive buildups to the triggers to eventually diminish the threat. The second thing in the toolbox would be to notice signs of hyperarousal. Now, often when we are triggered, there's cortisol spikes in our body, the fight, flight, freeze response is triggered, and there's a whole slew of physiological things that happen in our body. So if we can notice those signs, if we can notice that our heart starts to beat faster, our palms get sweaty, our ears get hot, whatever those signs look like for you, if you can notice them and pay attention to them, then you can take the steps towards using relaxation techniques. So making sure that you're exhaling longer than you're inhaling, splashing cold water on your face, maybe doing a bout of quick and intense exercise. Sometimes that can also make things worse if you're already, for example, triggered by elevated heart rate. So maybe don't do that thing for you. But figuring out different relaxation techniques that work well to minimize your hyperarousal. The third thing would be to practice knowing and showing your emotions. So as I mentioned, once you can name your emotions and know them, then you can better express them and show them to yourselves. And when we practice working through our emotions, giving them the space to exist with a compassionate and warm lens, then we can allow them to process more naturally, to not get built up inside, and to release some of those pent-up emotions associated to those triggers, so that when maybe later on faced with the same triggers, the emotional reactivity is not as disproportionate or strong. The last thing I will recommend is to seek therapy. So if you are triggered by specific things that elicit a very distressful and stressful symptoms and reactions within you, then go talk to someone who is trained in that specific domain. And there's different types of therapies that exist to treat PTSD or BPD or anxiety or whatever mental illness that you have that is associated to these triggers. So there's things like somatic therapy, there's EMDR, which is eye movement desensitizing and reprocessing therapy, if I'm not mistaken. And that's really allowing you to get the body to recognize the different triggers and where they're stuck in your body, so you can have someone help you work through those different things. Along the way, we can practice accepting what we cannot change. We can practice accepting that others will do things that set us off and trigger us. And this is really a way to practice self-kindness to ourselves and to help alleviate the suffering that comes along with having triggers. As always, I'm curious to hear from you in the comments down below to let me know what are some tools or things that have helped you work through triggers. And if you found this video useful, be sure to give it a like, because it's good for the YouTube algorithm, which means that the more people like this, the more my video gets shared, and the more that we help to break down the stigma surrounding BPD. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be here with me today, and I will see you back here next time for another episode of On the Line.